Chapter 15. Perched on the bottom step, Malou shouted, "Dan, will you come down here, please?" A moment later, Salangi and Malou heard him say, "What for? I've got enough to look through up here to last me hours." They then listened to his approaching footsteps. "What's the matter? Did you find a stepladder?" he yelled from the top landing of the basement staircase. "More than that, Dan. I think I know the book's title." "You do?" Dan exclaimed, running down the steps to join the two women. "Did Salangi tell you?" "No, Salangi didn't have to." Malou smiled at the old lady. "I figured it out." "But how?" "The tea, Dan." "What about it? Was it drugged?" "Oh, will you stop that? The tea is called shepherd's tea, which is a Greek tea." "So?" Dan queried, wide-eyed now. "So when Salangi here told me that we had a Herculean task ahead of us, and then when I remembered that the book was about redemption, I knew what the title of the book should be." "Well, what is it? Because these 3 words don't mean anything to me." "Think, Dan, think, will you?" "Let me give your mind a nudge, Dan," Salangi said, smiling. "The 12 Labours of Hercules. Does that ring a bell?" "Well, no, I wasn't that good in history, let alone in Greek antiquities, no." "Don't you see?" Malou went on. "Hercules was a half-god of Greek mythology, who had 12 redeeming tasks to perform, and the tea was a shepherd's tea. And then Salangi told you there had been a dozen people combing the shelves of this house for Damianos' book. And Damianos is the Greek name for tamer. Am I on the right track?" "Something like that, yes, Dan, but I think the title should read something like The 12 Herculean Tasks of the Shepherd," Malou suggested. "What about the tamer? Does that name come into that title?" "That would be stretching it a bit, I think," Salangi suggested. "Whatever the phrase is, I think you should look for a book written in Greek, in the title of which you would find the 4 words 12, Labours, Hercules, and Shepherd." Not waiting for another word from either woman, Dan found the stepladder, hurried back up the stairs, and began looking at the books on the top shelves of the den, while Malou brought an old box near the first shelf in the basement, got on top of it, and began scanning the titles on the spines of each of the books. Meanwhile, Salangi climbed the stairs and returned to the kitchen with a grin on her face. She had finally been able to find a couple who had the good sense of listening to what she had to say. She then went to the living room, cleared the coffee table, and trotted back to the kitchen to wash the dishes. "And they haven't touched my cookies," Salangi thought ruefully. "Maybe before they leave, I'll put in a little paper bag for them." She stopped and then lifted her gaze to the stormy clouds gathering around the horizon outside the window. "God, please let them find the book. It would be such a relief to know what it all means." It wasn't long until Salangi heard a squeal coming from the basement. "I've got it, Dan! I've got it!" Having heard her cry of joy, Dan rushed down the stairs with Salangi in slow tow. "Where was it?" Dan asked, looking down at a very old, thick and faded book in Malou's hands. Malou turned her face up to the farthest shelf in the back corner of the basement. "Down there," she replied, nodding in that direction. "Let me see," Dan said, taking the book from Malou's hands and blowing the dust off its cover. "Wow, did you see that?" "What is it?" Salangi asked, taking a peek at the book in between Dan and Malou. "Look," Malou said, turning to the old lady. "It's got some sort of webbing at each corner of the front cover. See?" "Goodness gracious, you're right, dear," Salangi replied, extending her hand and passing it over the cover. "What about this?" she asked, then pointing to the clasp at the side of the book. Dan turned it on its spine, and all 3 stared at the sort of latch and clasp that was keeping the book closed. Similar to the clasp and lock on a diary, it would prevent anyone from opening the volume unless one had the key to fit in the lock. "And what's the title?" Salangi asked, a frown drawing over her brow. "Just as I said," Malou replied happily, "the 12 Herculean Labours of the Shepherd. See, it's written in English in brackets." She pointed to the cover again. "All right then," Dan said decisively. "Let's get this thing to Damianos right now and get out of here." He was already rushing up the stairs. "Hold on, Dan," Malou yelled after him. "What about the key?" "Don't care about the key, Malou." She hurried after him. "We just needed to find the book and return it to him. Isn't that what he said?" He stopped on the top step and turned to Malou behind him. "Before you go running out of here," Salangi piped up, "I think Malou is right. The book is useless without the key." "Salangi's right, Dan," Malou agreed. "And you know as well as I do, Damianos is only telling you what you want to hear half of the time. The other half is all lies." Dan shrugged and made his way to the living room. "If we don't find the key," Malou went on, "that's another excuse for him to delay our return to Bohoki. And if it's any consolation," Salangi added, trailing in behind the couple, "I think I know where my husband kept the key." Springing up from the sofa where he had already plopped down, Dan said, "Okay then, let's get that key, shall we?" "On one condition, Dan," Malou blurted, coming to plant herself in front of him, "that you let me open the book." She peered at him. "Why?" "Because you're only too quick to pass judgment, Dan. You've already decided to kill Damianos as soon as we get out of here without giving a thought to what might happen if you did." "So? He's made a misery out of a dozen lives. Look at Salangi here. She's been living in this mansion for years and has no help in hell to get out. All of that because of Damianos. He keeps the people he could capture in cages, for heaven's sake. He told me so, and you want to give him the benefit of the doubt?" Malou stepped aside and looked at Salangi. She was crying. "Goodness, Salangi," Malou said, "don't cry now, please. If there is any way for us to bring you back to Pahokee, believe me, I'll be the first one to grab your hand and walk you through the veil of your real future with you." "I know, dear, I know," Salangi said between sniffles, "but for now, let me show you where the key is." With these words, the two of them followed the old dear up the front stairs to her bedroom. When she opened the door once again, Malou thought she was Alice in Wonderland, for it was a place of enticing magic and peaceful repose. The blue drapes on the far window, the large bed adorned of a laced bedspread which resembled a huge dream catcher, and the two high-backed chairs upholstered of the same blue fabric as the drapes were inviting you to a restful and dreamless night. "This is really a beautiful bedroom," Dan said, quite surprised to see it all so well decorated and clean. "Did you tat the comforter as well?" "Oh yes, that was one of the first dream catchers I did. I didn't want Damianos to join me in this room as he used to before I discovered what he really was." "And what is he to you?" Malou asked. "If you mean what he represents, I can tell you that I haven't made up my mind. He's done a lot of harm to a lot of people as you described, Dan, but I don't think he means everything he wants you to believe." "What do you mean by that?" Dan asked. "I mean, he is like a possessed being. He has moments of total lucidity and charm, or even kindness, and then all of a sudden he turns nasty for some reason. I often thought he wanted to regain his original state too." "You know, Salangi, he told me something like that when Dan was still in the hospital. He said he wanted to take a trip back to Pahokee and destroy these awful pictures that led people to believe they could return to their past and correct themselves." "Exactly, my dear," Salangi agreed, nodding. "And that's why I think it's important for us to open that book and see what that redemption he often spoke of is all about." Getting a bit impatient, Dan asked Salangi, "All right, where would we find the key?" "It's in here," Salangi said, stepping to the dresser and opening a small porcelain powder container. She dug her finger in the face powder and soon retrieved a small key from its hiding place. "There you go." She blew the powder off and handed the key to Dan. "Okay, thanks," Dan said, already wanting to insert the key in the lock of the strange and heavy volume. But Malou put a hand over the clasp. "Dan, please, let's go downstairs before we open it, okay?" All right, but we don't have that much time left." "I know, hun, but we need to be careful." "And an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," Salangi said from behind the couple. "You're right, I suppose," Dan replied. A few minutes later, the three of them were sitting in the living room once again, Salangi in one of the chairs facing the coffee table, and Malou and Dan on the sofa. They looked at each other, apprehension filling their minds. "I suppose we keep a hand on our dream catchers while you open the book, dear," Salangi suggested, looking at the couple intently. Dan held the book in his lap while his eyes travelled over the cover. "Look at this, Malou," he said, unexpectedly holding the hand back from nearing the lock with the key. "What is it?" Malou asked, peering down at the cover. "Oh dear God, the whole cover is embossed, with a dream catcher." She threw a glance at Salangi. "What does that mean?" "Maybe the book is protected the same way we are," the old lady replied. Dan's face lit up with a devious grin. And that's really why Damianos couldn't touch it. It wasn't because he couldn't locate it that he sent all these people to find it. It was because touching it would mean he would burn to hell if he did." "I guess he wants to destroy it, maybe," Malou ventured. "Maybe you're right, dear, but I also think that the demon he represents, or the one that dwells in him, doesn't want people to find out whatever is written among its pages." Dan shook his head and snickered. "I think you're right, Salangi. As long as Damianos can trick people into staying in their past while trying to find this book, he's safe. But if someone found it, like we just did, he would probably run for his damn life."